Hello, everybody. Today we're going to focus on WI3 and treaties and loss of land. This is a really important topic if you're going to talk about Wisconsin Indians because the treaties had incredible impacts for them. On the positive hand, it provided land that should be protected by the United States government, and so land that would become the reservations that Wisconsin Indians have. On the negative side, they had to give up so much. Many tribes gave up 70, 80, 90% of their land in order to have this treaty signed. And a lot of times they didn't want to sign the treaty, but they didn't feel like they had any other choice. So we're going to go through the basic notes, and then I'll give you kind of a more in-depth scenario of what happened for the Ojibwe or Chippewa. So here we go. To begin, a treaty is a document signed by two nations. In this case, it's signed by the United States and one of the Wisconsin Indian tribes. So the big question to start with is, was this a choice or force? And so after the Revolutionary War, American Indian tribes made various treaties with the United States. And why did they do so? Well, it was more force than choice. They feared if they didn't sign the treaties, they would have to fight the United States Army. And earlier on in US history, in the late 1700s, the United States wasn't that much of a force. But by the mid 1800s, around 1840, they started to have a much better army and they started to have a lot more power. And so these individual Wisconsin Indian bands, they did not have much strength compared to the US Army. And so sometimes they felt that they didn't sign the treaties, they'd have to face off. And they knew that wouldn't turn out very well for their citizens. So what do we see for treaty results? Well, we see a very significant decrease in land ownership. Many tribes signed treaties to stay within Wisconsin. Others are forced to move across the Mississippi River into Minnesota. And so if you look at your map on the bottom here, you can see all of Wisconsin at one point was, lived in by Wisconsin Indians. Well, now they only have the small chunks in the lighter color. And so a lot of land was given up in order to secure small portions of land that the US government promised they wouldn't invade. So we're going to look at a few specific results. Here we have the Chippewa or the Ojibwe, and they originally had millions of acres of land. And through a series of treaties, with the last one being in 1854, 4 reservations were created: the Bad River, the Coudray, Lac du Flambeau, and Redcliffe. And the end results, well, we see that the Native Americans, specifically in the Ojibwe band, lose ownership of millions of acres of land. They get to keep 275,000 acres and some yearly payments. And they're able to hunt, fish, and gather on the land. Excuse me, I don't know what happened here. Let me see if I can fix this so you can see my slide better. They are able to hunt, fish, and gather on the land they gave up for all of time. And that's a very important thing for them, to be able to keep that land, because they are going to need that in the future. All right, I had a little glitch. I'm back here now. So the last one that I was mentioning, they're able to hunt, fish, and gather on the land they gave up. And so they're able to keep doing that. Even though they gave up the land, they can still hunt, fish, and gather there, which is really a big deal even today. And we'll talk about that in later lectures. Now the results, well, the Menominee, they're pressured to give up about half their land, 3 million acres, for $146,000 over 12 years. Later, they're pressured to give up the rest of their land, selling it for about 5 cents an acre, which is just stealing it, basically. In 1854, they signed a treaty that allows them to have 276,000 acres in Wisconsin, but they only retain about 11% of their land. And so all the land here that you see in the yellow and the red and the orange, all that was land that the Menominee lived on. And in the end, they get to keep this small square right here. And that's all they get that is theirs. So that's a big shift. So this is in your notes. Imagine you were a Menominee during this time period. You've spent your life traveling throughout the land, hunting, fishing, and gathering. Now your nation has signed this treaty. How would this change your life? And so you had all this vast territory, and you traveled throughout it to get different food, to gather goods, to hunt, to fish, all that. And now you have to live in this small area with everybody within it. So in what ways would that change your life? It definitely would. So our next group are the Oneida. They lost over 5 million acres of land in New York because of illegal treaties. And so they move out west and they moved into Wisconsin. They're given 500,000 acres of land in Wisconsin that was taken from the Menominee. So how do you think the Menominee feel? They have to literally give up some of their land so other people get to live on it. In the end, the Oneida have about 10% of the land they originally did. So imagine living as an Oneida. Hold on. We got to fix that. Not living as an. There we go. That's better. Okay. So as a member of the United Nations, you have been forced to move from New York to Wisconsin. List 3 different ways that could impact your life. So how's your life going to be impacted if you no longer live in your home state and you have to live somewhere else now? So other groups in the results you can see for the Ho-Chunk, for the most part, they were forced to move to different territories throughout Minnesota, Iowa, Nebraska, and the Dakotas. But they did retain some land in these very small sections here. And you can see, this came later for some of them, late 1800s, early 1900s. They gained back some of that land in Wisconsin, but for the most part, they were forced out of the state with treaties. The Potawatomi originally had lived in this area down here. They give away this land in treaties. They're given reservations over in these areas. Some of them make an agreement to stay down here, and some of them head up north and hide out in the woods. And they do still own that land today, but that was not originally part of the treaty. So the overall result is this. American Indian tribes were promised reservation land in return for giving up large areas of land under their control and receiving annual payments from the United States government. Many times the land was sold for under 10 cents an acre. The bottom line was the United States wanted land for farming, for timber, for other purposes. And Wisconsin was a great area for that. And so they made these agreements with Native Americans so that they could get the land so the United States could continue to expand. So your last question for your notes, and then we'll move on to an example. Wisconsin Indians have traditionally used large amounts of land to hunt, fish, and gather. After the treaties, much of this land is gone. In exchange for the land, they were often given yearly financial payments. Based on what you know about how Wisconsin Indians live, why might they struggle with having financial payments instead of large areas to land to live on? So you go from a ton of land to you're living together on a very small piece of land in comparison, and now you have money that you're given yearly by the government. Why do you think they might struggle with less land, but having this newfound money? All right, on to the Chippewa example. The Chippewa, also known as the Ojibwe, you can use either term, it's fine. So one of the first treaties occurs in 1825. It's a treaty at Prairie du Chien. And sometimes it's interesting just to look at pictures. And if you look at this picture, you see the tents, you see the American flag. Here we have the Ojibwe. And over here we have the United States military. And so it's pretty interesting that they're making this treaty agreement, but right next to them, there's the military. It'd be like if the government wanted you to sign a document to give away, part of your home. And as you're trying to figure out the negotiations, you have 100 soldiers standing there armed and ready to fight. It's not going to help to make a real good situation. So here's what we have in 1825, the Prairie du Chien Treaty. The U.S. government tries to establish the borders of many American Indian tribes, including the Ojibwe people. It's not an easy task because they don't have one principal chief. Each band has its own leader. As a result, 41 chiefs are present at the signing. Now, for the United States to gain territory, they need to know the boundaries first. And so Prairie du Chien is setting up a situation where the United States will know the boundaries, so it becomes easier to make further treaties that will allow them to take territory. But this isn't an easy process, all right? Take a look at this. This is how they define the boundaries, because they don't necessarily have great maps or anything. I'm just going to read a portion of it. It is agreed between the Sioux and the Chippewas that the line dividing their respective countries shall commence at the Chippewa River, half a day's march below the falls, and from thence it shall run to Red Cedar River, immediately below the falls, from thence to the St. Croix River, which is strikes at a place called the Standing Cedar, about a day's paddle in a canoe above the lake of the mouth of that river. Thence passing between two lakes called the Chippewa Green Lakes, and by the Sioux the lakes they bury the eagles in, and from thence to the Standing Cedar that the Sioux split, thence to Rum River, crossing it at the mouth of a small creek called Choking Creek, a long day's march from the Mississippi, thence to a point of woods that projects into the prairie half a day's march from the Mississippi. Wow. So they're trying to figure out, all right, what does the Ojibwe own? What do the Sioux own? And because they don't have good maps, they need to use all these figures. But really, I mean, what does this mean? About a day's paddle in a canoe. How far is that? A long day's march. What's a long day's march? What if you don't know the names of these rivers? So it's really hard to figure out the boundaries between these groups because the Chippewa and the Sioux know kind of where their boundary is, but the United States coming in doesn't know that. But they have to do it so they can make a treaty with the Chippewa, or the Ojibwe as it is. If they don't know the boundaries, they can't make that treaty. So in 1826, we have another gathering at Fond du Lac. The Ojibwe are given some land rights. They get to retain some land, annuities, annual payments, a missionary school, and an attempted effort at peace. And the United States gains control of a lot of mineral rights. So there's a lot of minerals and types of rock to mine, and the United States wanted that. But here's how it operated when we talk about choice or force. U.S. soldiers drilled and demonstrated their power before the Ojibwe. One U.S. commissioner said to them, "You have never seen your great father's arm," the military, only a bit, and a very little bit of his little finger. So as you're trying to negotiate this agreement for your future as the Chippewa or Ojibwe, the army of the other territory is right next to you, and they're threatening that this is just a small portion of it. There's a lot more of us. So basically, sign the treaty or face us and you'll get crushed. What a nice way to make an agreement. Now, there's more treaties in 1837 and 1842. And in these treaties, a ton of the land the Chippewa have, they're forced to give up. If you look here, the whole area in purple is what they had, and they end up with the part in red. And so it's a very small amount of territory in general. So they gave up, an estimated 170 billion board feet of timber, 150 billion tons of iron ore, 15,000 lakes, access to river, all these different things. And they're given a very small portion of land, some goods and necessities, which we'll talk about later, and money. So here's what you have. The Ojibwe gained $19,000 in annual payments, $67,000 in goods and services, mixed blood, which would be Ojibwe mixed with French or British blood, receive $115,000. Unfortunately, a lot of this money ended up with John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company, which was owned by Americans. And so sometimes in these treaty deals, they would sign agreements with specific companies to provide these goods, but the companies gouged prices, inflated them, so they got more money. So even in that way, Native Americans aren't getting a real good shake here. Well, one of the questions that came up was, is the land for lease or sale? And the Ojibwe did not think they were selling the land. They thought they were basically leasing it. An example, timber rights. They believed they had sold the timber rights, but not the right of the land. So here's what an Ojibwe said about that. From the usual height of cutting a tree down and upwards to the top is what I sell you. I reserve the root of the tree. So the Ojibwe are feeling like, hey, from where you cut the tree off up, that's yours. You get all that tree, but we get the roots and we get the land. Well, the United States did not see it this way. They saw it as a land sale. And so differences in an opinion, and the United States is obviously going to win out because of their might. But the Ojibwe were very smart in this. They made sure to protect future generations with these treaties by guaranteeing the right to hunt, fish, and gather on the land they sold to the United States. The 1837 treaty states this: the privilege of hunting, fishing, and gathering the wild rice upon the lands and rivers and the lakes, including the territory ceded, is guaranteed to the Indians during the pleasure of the President of the United States. So as long as they have a good relationship with the president, they get to hunt, fish, and gather on the land that they gave up. And so if we go back a few slides here, Basically, what that's arguing is that they have the right to hunt, fish, and gather on any of these purple area if it's public land. Now, there's been disputes about that in Minnesota, but in Wisconsin, it's true. That's why the Ojibwe can do spearfishing when normal Wisconsinites cannot. They can go onto land and gather wild rice where others may not be able to, because part of giving up their land originally was the agreement that they get to do this. And so sometimes people get upset with spearfishing because they say, well, they get this right and we don't. Well, they have that right because the land a lot of Americans live on was their land, and they gave it up in part for that right. So that was a really smart move that has helped the Ojibwe even today to have some more resources available to them. Well, they were promised they wouldn't have to be removed from their land unless they misbehaved. But in 1848, rumors start to spread that the Ojibwe are going to be removed out of Wisconsin and Minnesota. And let's face it, nobody wants to live in Minnesota. I have to make a crack at Minnesota. I mean, I'm wearing a Packers sweatshirt. Come on. In 1850, President Zachary Taylor signed the removal order. But the problem was that there had been no problems. The Ojibwe had no reason to believe that they had problems with the United States government. But even so, the president signed the order. It stated the United States could better protect the Ojibwe from injurious contact with whites by moving them to Minnesota territory. So the thought process here is, hey, you might have problems between white Americans and Wisconsin Indians, so we're going to move you across the river so it's not an issue. It'd be like the government today telling you that you're going to have a problem with your neighbor, so we're going to force you to live in a different state. It's not a real great situation, and the Ojibwe don't want to leave their homeland. The reality is the U.S. want to use the Ojibwe. On the other side in Minnesota are the Sioux. And the Sioux are more unpredictable. They're more of a warlike people. And the United States is afraid of them. So they think, hey, we're here. The Sioux are here. Let's put the Ojibwe in the middle so that they can provide a buffer to prevent our settlers and the Sioux from having contact, because they knew that would mean warfare and that would be expensive. So they're going to use the Ojibwe and force them to move out west. Well, it's a tragic situation that we see. I linked in the instruction page a video. It is this one right here. Hold on a second. So it's called the Sandy Lake Tragedy. If you want to watch it, you can. It's about 27 minutes. And it does show the story of what was faced by Wisconsin Indians in this situation. So what happens? Well, every year, normally, the Ojibwe have people from the United States government come to their territories in Wisconsin and provide them with their annual payments that they were to receive because they gave up their land. Well, the United States decided one year that you had to receive your payments in Sandy Lake, Minnesota in late November. Now, this is really strange because they've always received it in Wisconsin, but now they're forced to go to Minnesota to get their payment in November. Think about that. It takes a long time to walk there. By the time you're walking back, it may be December, it may be January or February, and it's cold and you're walking. That is not a good situation. Well, the reality was they were trying to get all the Ojibwe to come over here to Sandy Lake, hoping that because of the bad winter, they'd have to stay there. Their crops and other things would be ruined here, and they would live in Minnesota then. It was basically a plot by some within the U.S. government to keep Native Americans in Minnesota and to take over their land in Wisconsin. Well, when they got there, those that went, their money wasn't available. And so they had to wait there a long time, and they didn't have good food. A lot of it was moldy or rotten or had worms, things like that. And they decide, 400 Ojibwe decide, we're going to travel back home because we need to be there for the spring to start our crops, and we don't want to lose our land. So 400 travel back home in the middle of a brutal winter. And as a result, 170 die from hunger, disease, and the cold. And the sad thing is it didn't have to happen. And I think the United States government would recognize that today. They didn't have to go there because they were always paid over here, but the desire was to kick them out of Wisconsin. Well, it didn't work for the United States, thankfully. And they did go back home, but tragically, almost half of them lost their lives. So this is 1850. Well, in 1854, it's obvious that the Ojibwe are not leaving Wisconsin, so another treaty is made. 4 reservations were created at the time. There's 6 Ojibwe tribes, but only 4 were made originally. The Bad River, Le Coudray, Lac du Flambeau, and Red Cliff. And they were, again, given this right to hunt and fish on the land that they gave up. And they're guaranteed they could stay on that land. So basically the government was guaranteeing them, saying, look, we will not take this land. And to this day, these nations still own the land in these territories. It is their own country within the United States of America, where they get to have their own government and make their own laws. And so that's what we see when it comes to treaties. That's some of the conditions that we saw Wisconsin Indians faced, and it was tough. Thankfully, the United States government has continued to hold these treaties as law. Wisconsin Indians are still given the right to hunt, fish, and gather on northern lands, and they've been able to keep the land that they have. But it's a tragic situation that they were forced to sell in the first place. They were bullied by the United States government, and that made them do things they didn't necessarily want to do. And so we're going to see a major shift for Wisconsin Indians. Now, instead of being able to, be a little nomadic and move around and hunt and gather and fish in different places, they're going to be stuck in one spot. And that's going to change how they can live and how they can survive. And that's kind of what we're going to look at next. So with this unit, what you have next is there is a treaty assignment where you're looking at parts of a real treaty and deciding what it means for Wisconsin Indians. And then you have your journal entry as well. I did put a link as well if you want to watch that video on the Sandy Lake tragedy in your instruction sheet for the unit. So as always, if you have questions, talk to your teacher and we'll go from there. Have a great day, everybody.